Joining us now on Texans Radio, it's General Manager and Executive Vice President Nick Caserio. Nick, well, week 2, here we go. After week 1, let's review some of the things about the game against the Ravens. Obviously, it's not the way you wanted it to go. There were some things that you can take moving forward, though.
Yeah, sure. Definitely did a number of good things in the game. Put ourselves in a decent position there in the first half. The second half, I would say, like most games, usually boils down to a handful of plays, a handful of possessions. The Ravens made a few more plays than we did in the end. But overall, I mean, certainly did some things well, certainly some things that we can improve. A good opportunity here this week in the division at home. So we're looking forward to the opportunity in front of us.
Nick, I know there's a lot of talk about CJ and rookie quarterbacks and all that kind of stuff. And I don't want to say Will Anderson kind of flew under the radar, but I don't know there's as much talk about Will Anderson until Sunday. And then he seemingly unleashed. What did you see from the youngster on Sunday against the Baltimore Ravens?
Yeah, defensively, we played well as a team to limit, I would say, explosive Ravens offense to under 300, whatever it was.
Yep.
Really, other than the long completion there to Odell, they had a couple PI penalties, but able to limit the explosives. But, front played well. The ends, both Will and JG had some disruptive plays. So I think that group overall has been pretty consistent through training camp and into week 1. So I think the big thing will be continuing that moving forward. Will be a different set of challenges and circumstances this week with the Indy offense, but say overall off to a pretty good start.
Offensive line, we've talked about this a lot all offseason, really, and you never know what kind of situations are going to present themselves. And another one did in the course of the game with the injury to George and everything. And going in, you had to mix and match a little bit.
Yeah, we were prepared going in. We're going to take 8 linemen into the game, so you kind of have all right, what's your next move if something were to happen? So George went out. Mike had worked a little bit of tackle during training camp. Josh has played tackle, played guard most of the game. So in the end, we're just trying to figure out how to allocate the resources as best we can. So overall, that group held up fairly well against a pretty good front. There's a few plays there, and some of the boots and the keepers, where quarterback's on the edge. So if they make the play, then, those things are going to happen. A couple times where they had maybe an extra guy than we could block or account for. But, that's going to happen during the course of the game. But overall, the group held up, I'd say, fairly well against a pretty good front.
Nick, one of the things I always worry about in week 1 is tackling, and I was really concerned. Obviously, you got Lamar, you got Gus Edwards, and you got J.K. Dobbins, even the receivers, Zay Flowers, and all guys that can different combinations of the way they carry the ball. I was really concerned about that, but I feel like the tackling was pretty good. What did you see when you went back and looked at it on tape?
Yeah, for a lot of guys, it was the first time this season where they're actually live tackling, but I would say it's something that we put an emphasis on in practice. How we attack the ball, the angle of approach, doing it at full speed. It's about aiming points and positioning. So those are things that are emphasized on the defensive side of the ball and in a kicking game as well. So there was a few plays Zay was able to get out of the one on third down. Lamar is just an elusive player, is hard to tackle. But by and large, tackling was pretty solid especially for week 1.
How hard is it to establish rhythm in the passing game with, I know there was preseason action, no doubt, lots of practice, but there you are in a real contest at Baltimore, tough place to play, and it seemed like things started to get clicking a little bit in the second quarter.
Yeah, definitely had our moments. The passing game, it's all 11 players that are involved. It's the offensive line, it's the quarterback making the right decisions, the receivers being in the right spot, making the right decision against the right coverage. And then there's a timing element that's involved as well. Timing, accuracy, and D'Amico has talked about this. Bobby's talked about it. Trying to play as best we can with precision on a snap-to-snap basis. Times where we did that, it looked good. Other times, didn't look as good. But there are things that we can certainly clean up and improve and get better. So really what you're trying to do is build on what happened in week 1, try to accentuate some of the strengths, the areas that you need to get fixed or improved, make sure that there's a heightened emphasis on those, and it's a new set of challenges and circumstances specific to the opponent this week in Indy.
We talk about season 1 to season 2 jumps, for rookies going to their second year. But I would imagine, Nick, during the season, week 1 to week 2 jump, that sort of jump is, okay, got game 1 out of the way. Here's how we looked at the film. Here are the expectations we now have going forward into week 2. Is there that kind of jump from week 1 to week 2, and the expectations sort of, change, but heighten a little bit from what you saw from week 1?
No question. The early part of the year is really about improvement. Can you improve from week 1 to week 2, week 2 to week 3, and then after, we've talked about this on the show, about game 4 or 5, you sort of have an idea of, all right, how things are going to go. What are some of the things that you're doing well? The teams that are watching you, your opponents, are going to be looking at the same thing. So you kind of have a core foundation in place. All right, here are the things that we're going to hang our hat on. All right, and if we have to make a modification or adjustment either to the look, to the formation, or introduce maybe a different concept that's going to help us, then you're going to do that. But it's 17 games, and from where you start week 1 to the end, you're probably going to see a different team and different players and just their overall evolution.
Nick, during COVID, the practice squad rules changed, and you could protect certain guys and things like that. And just speaking in general terms here as we record this, how hard is it to decide who to sign to the 53-man roster, who to leave on the practice squad? You can elevate them, but not that much. And do you look at the other teams and their needs, too, to see who they might target on your practice squad?
You're cognizant of where other teams are. We track every team in the league. We kind of know where they are day to day with the roster, who's on the active, who's on the practice squad, where's the hole, where's the need. Whether or not one of your players is going to be relevant to that team, it's going to change probably for 32 different teams. So I think what teams are doing, they're essentially managing 65, 70 players on a week-to-week basis. Some of it is need-driven or need-based. Something happens in the game. Does that force you to make a move? Do you have an in-house option? Do you have to go outside of the organization to find a player to fill that spot? Really what you want to probably do is also focus on the guys that have been in training camp. So they're probably more equipped to handle practice, to handle the speed, to handle the pace. They're hopefully going to be in condition. So we track that. We look at it weekly. We've targeted certain players, maybe 20 to 25 players on other teams' practice squad in the event. If we had an option or had the opportunity to add this player to the team, is this something that we'd want to do? So we actually had some of those discussions here over the weekend, even going into the game and then after the game. So I think that's sort of the week-to-week sort of roster management that teams have to deal with from now until the end.
Okay, good small talk, guys. Good appetizers. Good appetizers.
Now
Let's get to the entree. It's week 2. It's Indianapolis. It's a two-pronged question, Nick. So I'll ask you this one first. I think a lot of people would say, oh, Lamar Jackson, Anthony Richardson, they're running quarterbacks. They're the same. They probably couldn't be more different size-wise, some of the things they do. So how is the challenge different from Richardson versus Jackson? And then let's dive into the scouting report of the Colts, because I would think you know them pretty well.
Yeah, I would say the reality is they're both unique players, unique athletes. They're different types of players. I think sometimes guys get lumped into the same general category, but they're both highly skilled, highly talented players. I would say in Anthony's case, his size, speed, strength combination, there's not too many people like him in the league. The closest one is probably Cam. We had Cam in New England there at the end a little bit. When Cam came out, he was big, strong, fast, athletic. And I would say specific to the Indy offense, the quarterback essentially is the running game, which I would say in Baltimore's case, they've evolved a little bit to sort of a different dynamic. But Anthony was their leading rusher the other day. I know JT's not available, not probably going to – he's PUP for however many weeks it is. But Anthony's a big part of the running game, so you certainly have to account for that. But big, strong, is skilled and talented, is a thrower or just a player at that position from his size, his speed, his strength. He's just there are not too many players like him. So, and Shane's done a good job of kind of building the offense a certain way. It has some Philadelphia elements, but it's really what does Anthony do well within the construct of the other players that they have on their team. Scouting report wise, we talked about Rich. They've added some good young players. I would say just on the offensive side of the ball, they made a couple changes on the front. Raymond looks like he's kind of solidified himself as a left tackle, was kind of the swing backup tackle last season. He was kind of, in and out. Fisher was there, then they lost Fisher, then eventually Raymond was there. Smith has been a pretty solid player there over there on the right side, and Kelly's been, let's say, one of the more underrated centers in the league. And I have Q over there at left guard, and then Will is over there at right guard. So number of tight ends on the team. I think Ogletree got hurt in the opening game. Mallory's a guy they drafted in the 5th round this year who sounds like he's had a pretty good training camp, so I think there's a chance we're going to see him. And the running backs, and they've kind of said this, it's kind of by committee. They all kind of have different things that they do well. Jackson to Hall, sounds like Moss might be ready to play. Moss, they got it as a part of the Hines trade there. Last year. And Pittman is a really good football player. I think he had, 90 for 1,000-ish or somewhere in there last year. So he's kind of the go-to guy. Drafted Downs in the 3rd round this year, so it gives them kind of a presence inside the formation. Took Pierce in the 2nd round last year, so they've invested in the offense. And then you flip over to the defense. I mean, this is a really good defense. I'd say a really good front 7. We talked last year about Grover. Everybody talks about Buck, but not too many people talk about Grover. They really play 8. They roll them through. It looks like Quiddy's improved. He's off to a good start here. Signed Ebukam, who was with San Francisco last year. And Odenegbo, Lewis. So they play Taven Bryan, kind of gives them 3 for 2 inside. So they're going to play 8. Leonard's back, so he's healthier than he was. Could cause problems. And really one of their best players on defense is probably Zaire Franklin. He's kind of emerged as sort of the leader, shows up around the ball, really explosive. Speed, looks like he has a little bit of a role defensively, probably one of the tougher kicking game matchups because of his size, speed, length combination. In the secondary, a couple of younger players, first-year players that were on a practice squad roster last year in Flowers and Baker. Kenny Moore's probably one of the better nickels in the league. Looks like he's healthy. And then Blackman and then Rodney Thomas, who was a 6th-round pick last year. So this is a good defense. They play fast, a good front, very disruptive. They gave Jacksonville problems. I mean, they kept them in the game. They scored on defense. So, I mean, this is going to be a big challenge here defensively, and it'll be a different sort of look and dynamic relative to what we saw last week against against Baltimore.
How does it help you? They play the Jaguars, and you faced the Jaguars pretty late last year, and they're very similar to what they were last year. They've made some changes, of course, but does that give you a good baseline to evaluate this version of the Colts?
Yeah, no question, Mark. It's really interesting because you're kind of seeing your next 2 opponents play. So you're looking at Indy, but you're also conscious of Jacksonville, understanding, okay, a week from now, we're going to be sitting here talking about Jacksonville. So anytime you're in the division, especially early in the year, and when you see your next 2 opponents, I mean, it's good for all of us. So focus on Indy, but you kind of have in the periph, all right, Jacksonville, all right, who's playing, maybe some of the new players, and then you can dive in a little bit more schematically next week when we focus on the Jaguars.
I'm glad you brought up Grover Stewart because I've been trying to push that forward, and everybody talks about Defoe and how good he is. But those 2 together are such a problem. We've seen it, Nick, but why are they such a problem, Stewart and Buckner inside?
Yeah, I would say, John, they complement each other. So Buck is just a unique matchup, 6'5", 305, rare length and athleticism. And then Grover is a big, massive human being. Yeah. So they're both good against the run. Grover's probably a little better run player than he is a pass player, but he can still rush. Buck presents some matchups in pass protection because of his length and athleticism, whether he's on a guard or a tackle. So they complement each other very well, and they're going to be primarily a 4-down front, and they can create some matchup problems depending upon who they're lined up against.
All right, Nick, we asked D'Amico Ryans this question, and this is a huge rival for the Houston Texans, obviously, the Colts. And instead of going to college, because we know about Mount Union and the nemesis they were,
we never beat them. I wouldn't call it a rivalry if you don't beat somebody.
But what about high school? Who was the biggest high school rival for you?
Wow. So the high school I went to was an all-boys, small, private Division III school, and we were independent. So we didn't have a conference per se. Yep. We had the interstate prep, but there was 3 teams in it. So I would say the school down the street, Gilmore Academy, was similar to us. So I would say Gilmore and Hawken Academy were probably 2 of the most similar types of schools and or teams. I'd say we had decent success against Gilmore and Hawken both. So much better than what happened against Mount Union. I can say that for sure. I'm sure Nick Sirianni will love to hear that.
I actually saw, I think, Sirianni's last college game when he was at Mount Union, 2003 national championship game against St. John's. My buddy went to St. John's, and we drove up to the game. And I didn't find out till years later. I think that was Sirianni's last game at Mount Union, and they lost. So I'm sure,
which didn't happen very often.
Didn't happen. So. I think it was 58 games at the time. I think it was 58
That's
games
probably
at the
close.
time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, nobody was beating them. I mean, not even John Carroll.
We talked about the Steichen offense, right? What he took with him from Philadelphia. And do you follow that stuff closely, or do you wait a long time or a little time anyway to see how Gannon is running the defense in Arizona, how Steichen might run the offense in Indianapolis and stuff like that?
Yeah, typically what you do is you kind of study coaches and their history and what their background. So Shane kind of grew up with Coach Wisenhunt. So that was kind of where he's rooted in that system, and Wisenhunt, Norv Turner. But I think what you've seen from a lot of coaches is they evolve and they make whatever their system or offense is specific to their team, and it's very personnel driven. So who are the players? What are they? And Shane has come out and said this. So essentially what they're doing is they've built an offense around what Anthony does well. So they've gone back and looked at some of the things at Florida, looked at some different ideas. So you're looking at, they have a base foundation of how they were trained and where they started, and then they kind of put their own spin on it relative to where they are in their coaching evolution, where their team is, who are their players. So everybody kind of has a base scheme, but then you have to look at your team and say, what's our personnel, and then figure out how we deploy those resources accordingly.
Along those lines, Nick, preparation is never easy, and I don't make it out to be easy at all. But the fact that Gus Bradley is still there as a defensive coordinator, and he has been there for a while, does that help in preparation? The fact that, okay, you've seen that defense before. A lot of the names you brought up, we've played against a lot of those guys before, and Gus has been there for a few years, so maybe there's a body of work there. Does that make it any, I don't say easier, but does it help the preparation at all?
You have a little bit more of a background, so we can go back and look at some of the things that have taken place previously. But I would say, like, there's another good example. Gus is a great coach, and I'd say he's evolved. His system and defense has evolved from where it was with Coach Carroll in Seattle. I think there's this misnomer. It's the Seattle 3, and that's all it is. I mean, Gus has evolved, and his system is specific to the Colts and how they want to play, which I'd say it's very similar to what a DQ is doing in Dallas as well. So the way Dallas is playing, and DQ kind of grew up, I would say, in a similar system. But this goes back to what we just talked about. Coaches evolve. We got a lot of really smart coaches, really good players. And year to year, you kind of have to change some of the things that you're doing, because everybody was going to go back and look at, all right, if you've just been doing the same thing, all right, it declares itself during the course of the game, but there might be some tweaks, whether it's, okay, instead of playing 2-3 techniques, you got a 2-eye, or playing a 2 and a 3 technique, or you want to play them as 6 instead of a 7, or how they play the safety, what's the role, what's the fit. So there's a lot that goes into it, which, again, it goes back to there's a lot of really good coaches in this league. And even though, like, we've played against Gus, we've played against Gus here in Houston, and played against Gus multiple times when I was in New England. And I would say from the times that we played Gus in New England to what Gus is doing now, it's a little bit different. And I think that's a credit to the coaches and how they evolve and change. And I think if you talk to D'Amico, he would say the same thing. When you look at some of the things that I would say they did in San Francisco, some of the things that we're doing, there's a base kind of foundation, but there's small tweaks along the way, and that's kind of what you have to do to kind of stay ahead.
The last few years, unfortunately, you've had to talk to a lot of coaches in the coaching hiring process. And I know that can be grueling in some sense, but I know at heart, it feels like you're a coach at heart. Do you enjoy sitting across from coaches and kind of getting to know more about them and more about their schemes and more about all that? It feels like that you get a charge out of learning about what other teams do and what coaches do.
You learn a lot. And I think if you open your mind and you just kind of listen, when you watch a team or a coach like play,
right,
you're kind of formulating your thoughts and your ideas. Right. You're keeping notes. All right, and then when you have an opportunity to have a conversation, it could confirm or refute maybe some of the things that you see, and then you get a better understanding of, okay, it's how they think, their thought process, their philosophy. So I think to your point, John, I grew up. When I was finished playing football, my biggest mentor, Joe Perella, God rest his soul, like, he was a coach at heart. And he inspired me to want to get into football and coach. And I'd say my career is kind of a winding road, kind of, and my background is maybe a little bit different than some other folks. But I think when you kind of have an understanding schematically and from a coaching standpoint, it helps from a player evaluation standpoint, because you're trying to take a player and project him into a system, and you want to have some understanding of how that fits. So, you try to take a positive in everything. So to your point, we've talked to a lot of coaches, but I've enjoyed the conversation, the opportunity to really get to know them a little bit more, and then kind of have an understanding of philosophically, how they think or what they believe in.
If you went back to the university school right now and coached, would you run wishbone,
no
run
wishbone.
and shoot?
Never ran the wishbone. I don't understand the wishbone.
Wear wing tee?
We were a kind of a pro-style 3- and 5-step drop back. Not a lot of boots and nakeds, kind of play action. Had autonomy at the line of scrimmage, control. The offense I ran in high school was the same offense as I ran in college. because it was the same coach. Coach Perella coached me in high school, and he coached me at John Carroll. But the quarterback, a lot of autonomy at the line of scrimmage. Get out of a play, could change the protection, could flip the play the other way. So, not everybody liked that, but coach had enough faith in me that I would make the right decision. So, I think this is kind of how my mind thinks and works. So, we could probably talk football for 2 hours. There's no question.
Well, we'll do that on another occasion. Thanks so much for the visit, Nick.
Thanks, guys.